Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Extremely excited to record today's video covering Zach LaVine and some potential trades we could see for the Chicago Bulls shooting guard, who of course has made an all-star game in the past, has been a high volume scorer throughout most of his NBA career, and is a very talented player. Now, there is a little bit of discrepancy here though between his actual talent level and his trade value around the league because of his contract, and I don't want those two things to conflate with each other. Zach LaVine is very good at basketball, but he's also not the most valuable contract in the NBA, which completely hampers his trade market. And a big reason why he's still in Chicago is because teams are probably not going to give up real draft capital to land Zach LaVine. In fact, most teams would probably want draft capital back to take in LaVine's contract, given the current CBA and how punitive it is for some of the best teams in the NBA who have already big contracts on their roster. To take in another contract could be very, very harmful. Now, LaVine is making about $7 million less this upcoming season than someone like Bradley Beal, so it's not like he has the absolute worst contract in the NBA, but his contract definitely isn't the strongest either. So that does come into play here when we talk about his potential trade value. So let's look at that actual contract. What does it look like? There are only 3 years left on LaVine's contract, including this upcoming season where he's making about $43 million, the year after roughly $46 million, and then that final year, 2026-2027, is a player option for nearly $49 million. Now, this isn't, like I said, a good contract. It's not a great contract. LaVine is not worth $45-50 million in today's current market with the CBA and how punitive it is, again, for teams to spend big money, go over the luxury tax into the aprons. It makes it really hard for a team to want to go out and acquire Zach LaVine given this current contract. But I also want to say the cap is about to jump a bit. We're going to see continuous increases over the next 2 or 3 years in the cap, making this contract look a little bit better, especially in those final years. Even though it is going up itself a little bit, you see how the percentage of the cap is actually going down in that second column alongside the cap hit. So LaVine's contract isn't the absolute worst thing. Now, there is a 15% trade kicker in it as well. So in this video where we talk about potential trades, that would have to obviously get paid out and would be an impactful part of any deal here, is the fact that he does have a trade bonus in this deal that likely Chicago would have to cover too. So that is important to note, and another reason why Chicago might be hesitant to trade him outside of just the value perspective. But let's jump into that first trade. What could Chicago theoretically land for Zach LaVine? And the first one I have here is a deal with the Los Angeles Clippers, where LaVine goes to LA along with a couple of second-round draft picks, and in return, the Bulls get a bunch of short, expiring contracts and a couple of valuable players. The most valuable player that Chicago is receiving back in this deal is Norm Powell, who has been an elite sixth man for the Los Angeles Clippers. Really could have been in the running this past season for sixth man of the year. Now, he did not win the award, obviously. That went to Naz Reid. But Norm Powell has been a vital spark plug off the bench for the Clippers. Now, he is a little bit older as a player. He only has a little bit of team control left on his contract, but it's a very fair number for Norm Powell, a little bit over $19 million this upcoming season. And you have PJ Tucker, who opted into that player option at over $11 million this season. Daryl Morey is the one who gave him that contract, just a reminder. Bones Highland obviously has his $4 million contract with the Clippers. And then Amir Coffey, who's been a really good developmental story for LA as well, came into the league out of the U of M, the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Could not shoot the basketball for a lick. Was a point guard, could drive the ball and dish. Came into the NBA with really no semblance of a reliable three-point jump shot, and his time with the Clippers G League affiliate really harnessed that part of his game, became a high-volume three-point shooter down in the G League, and has turned himself into a quality NBA player. I wouldn't say a very good one, but a quality one, someone who can be a back-end rotation piece. And for Chicago, who's kind of in the middle of a retransformation of their roster, obviously we don't know if Lonzo Ball is going to play or not this season. They just went out and acquired Josh Giddey, who will probably be the focal point of their offense. You can make the argument that keeping Zach LaVine does make sense around Josh Giddey, giving him some type of gunner, transition runner, and shooter. Obviously, one of LaVine's greatest strengths is his perimeter shooting and scoring capabilities. he does make sense to stay in Chicago, which is why the Bulls probably would not attach a first-round pick to get off of him, in my opinion. But I could see them justifying a couple of second-rounders, especially getting someone like Norm Powell back who can fill a similar type of role. But this opens up a little bit more long-term flexibility for Chicago, getting to actual cap space in the near future. Powell's contract would end at the exact same time as Nikola Vucevic's contract, so Chicago could line up for the summer of 2026 and look to go out and make a splash then around Josh Giddey at that point in time if they made a deal like this. And for the Clippers' perspective, obviously LaVine's contract's huge, but I do think from a timeline perspective this does make some sense as well. LaVine is in his late 20s currently. He would be the youngest of the three stars there in LA between him, Harden, and Kawhi Leonard. Now obviously there's injury history here with LaVine, another problem that I could see coming to head there in LA, just with the injuries between him, Kawhi Leonard, very similar to what we just saw with Paul George and Kawhi. The reason I think this from a timeline perspective does make some sense, LaVine's a little bit younger than the other stars, and he is another big name player who has 3 years left on his contract, and that 3-year contract mark is super important here. A lot of the discussions between the Clippers and Paul George, according to Paul George himself, were initially shorter term contracts, not wanting to go 4 or 5 years on a contract with Paul George, and instead wanting to mirror what they had given to Kawhi Leonard, which was a 3-year, $150 million contract that starts this season. Looking at Zach LaVine's, his number is a little bit less than that 3 years, 150, but it is a total of 3 years. So the Clippers, just like how the Bulls can make a run in the 2026 offseason, maybe the Clippers could realign themselves for a run at the 2027 offseason, where after Kawhi Leonard and Zach LaVine are both off the books, James Harden's probably going to be off the books. He has a player option going into the 2026 season. The Clippers could go out with massive amounts of cap space after still trying to be competitive with this current roster. They owe their draft picks out the door, so they should be trying to win. I do think Zach LaVine is a talent upgrade here over the other players they're giving up, especially from a long-term perspective. Given the amount of expiring contracts, I do think this makes some sense for the Clippers. I also like the way that this opens up flexibility in the short and long term for Chicago as well. I think this is a win-win trade for both sides, honestly. And if a team does trade for Zach LaVine, my ultimate guess would have to be that it's the Los Angeles Clippers, because I think their contracts and their current team situation makes the most sense as a landing spot for the former All-Star guard. Now let's jump in to trade number 2. And again, this one has Zach LaVine being the sole player coming out of Chicago, and this time going to Golden State. We talked about the Warriors as a potential Brandon Ingram trade landing spot as well. The Warriors have been really hunting and looking for scoring off the wing. Remember, they were very aggressively in on Paul George. They were also reportedly in on Lauri Markkanen. Now, they weren't willing to give up Brandon Podziemski, and probably didn't want to give up Jonathan Kuminga either. That's the beauty of trading for Zach LaVine here, is you don't have to attach any of your premium young players. In fact, you're just attaching salaries back in this deal. And I think, again, this is something that makes sense for Chicago, because you're not even having to give up draft assets here in this deal. You're just taking back expiring pieces and another so-so contract. Not as bad as Zach LaVine's contract, but still not a good one in Andrew Wiggins. So it's basically a bad contract swap for a bad contract. The Warriors get the better player, the more talented player here in Zach LaVine. 2 former Minnesota Timberwolves get swapped for each other, funny enough. Former teammates of the same draft, obviously. Pretty crazy to see them in a trade together now, getting swapped for each other. But in this deal, the Bulls do get Andrew Wiggins, someone who I still think his cutting ability, his athletic traits, and his point of attack defense could be valuable there in Chicago. Again, around Josh Giddey, if you're trying to reconfigure this roster a little bit around Giddey, try and make him as successful as possible after trading Alex Caruso for him. Andrew Wiggins could be a beneficial piece around him, as could Zach LaVine. So even though you're trading Zach LaVine here, you're getting a player that I think could fit theoretically in a vacuum around Giddey because of his athletic traits and cutting ability. Gary Payton II, another point of attack defender, someone who could fit pretty well there in Chicago and alleviate some of the on-ball defensive responsibilities there. After trading Caruso, we don't know if Lonzo Ball is going to play. Gary Payton II could actually be valuable for them in a short, small role. I don't think he's going to be a 30-minute per game guy, of course. And then Kevon Looney, a backup big here for Chicago. They did lose Andre Drummond. Obviously, they have Nikola Vucevic to a contract that I would not have signed him to, but they did sign him to that. Now they get Kevon Looney to come off the bench, gives you 48 minutes of good center play, and it does set up Josh Giddey to probably showcase his best talent, giving him someone who's a very good screen and roll guy. Now Looney, obviously not a great finisher around the rim. One of his biggest detractors actually as a player is his lack of rim finishing, but he's been a monster screen setter for the Golden State Warriors. Now the question is, will he get away with a bunch of illegal screens playing in Chicago? I don't know, but he definitely does in Golden State. And then for the Warriors perspective, again, it's just a talent grab here. LaVine gives them the shooting. He's a pretty significant upgrade, in my opinion, over Andrew Wiggins from just a talent perspective. Wiggins has also been struggling with his own availability, and after the Warriors made some big moves this offseason, bringing in Buddy Hield, Kyle Anderson, obviously have made a bunch of different shifts, lost Klay Thompson. I do think they just need some more scoring punch, and they've also replenished some of their depth in a way. Losing Klay Thompson, they were able to bring in multiple players, DeAnthony Melton as well. I think it just makes some of these other guys a little bit more expendable in a trade where you're sending out 3 for 1 because you brought in 3 players to replace Klay Thompson. You're betting on Trayce Jackson-Davis taking that big step forward as probably your starting center long term. Now it does hurt to give up Kevon Looney, but the Warriors find so much success playing small anyway with Draymond Green. So I think giving up Looney is something that is feasible and doable here for a talent grab on Zach LaVine. Trade number 3, and it's with the Utah Jazz, and this time Zach LaVine goes to Utah in what is purely a talent grab for Danny Ainge, something I've talked about at length over the last few months. Don't sleep on Danny Ainge making trades like this. Remember last offseason, he traded a second-round pick that was pretty heavily protected to Atlanta to go snag John Collins. Did John Collins make a ton of sense for Utah's roster? In my opinion, no, but it was a pure talent grab, and now with John Collins' contract, which was basically salary dumped by Atlanta a year ago, he's able to use that contract and another piece to go get a player who is in his late 20s, still is talented, and could help Utah maybe take a couple of steps forward and put together some pieces and really try out some players around some of their young guys. They just extended Lauri Markkanen, very good contract in my opinion for Utah and for Lauri. I think it was a win-win for both sides. The Jazz don't have a lot of money committed to anyone else really on the roster. They have a couple of these mid-sized contracts like John Collins, like Jordan Clarkson. They can afford to pay LaVine for a few years because they have a bunch of guys on rookie contracts. Isaiah Collier, Keontae George, Taylor Hendricks, Kyle Filipowski, obviously. They've got Cody Williams on a rookie contract. They've got so many guys on small contracts that they can afford to be a team that takes a gamble here on Zach LaVine, because in 2-3 years, well, LaVine's either going to be an expiring contract or completely off the books, and that's when the Jazz would need to start paying some of their own draft picks. So I think with that rationale, this could be a worthwhile upside grab here for Danny Ainge, giving him a contract to work with. Maybe he could trade it later when it's closer to an expiring deal, and he could use it in a deal with some of his draft picks to maybe go get a star player. And you are just extending your contract timeline a little bit here if you're Utah. I think having contracts on the books is always better than not. Unless you're lining up for $90 million, $60, $70 million in cap space, you need to have contracts on the books. Utah is not going to be a prime premier free agency destination. So for that reason, acquiring Zach LaVine maybe does make some sense, especially if the cost is only John Collins and Jordan Clarkson. Again, for Chicago, this lines you up for the 2026 offseason. Collins, Clarkson, and Vucevic would all come off the books at the same time. You could really set yourself up as a premier destination. Again, if you're Chicago, you're going to have a couple of young players, Montez Buzelis, obviously, who we'll see who they get in the 2025 draft. But they're going to have a bunch of young pieces. They can maybe become a selling point rather quickly, depending on how quickly this rebuild accelerates and how Josh Giddey performs with the basketball in his hands way more frequently than he did in OKC. So I think this is a long-term upside risk here for Chicago, and I think for Utah, it's about adding talent in, putting pieces around some of their young guys, seeing what fits and what works and what doesn't, adding a little bit more shooting, adding some more wing play, and I think LaVine is just flat out a better player than either John Collins or Jordan Clarkson, and that's why Utah does that deal here in this situation. So now, what are my actual real expectations for Zach LaVine? Will he get traded? Will he not get traded? My true, real, honest expectation, Zach LaVine is going to stay a Chicago Bull. I would be relatively surprised if he does get dealt, just given his current context. I think most teams around the league, even though, as you can tell, I'm kind of optimistic about what a trade for him could look like. I'm optimistic about how his contract isn't as horrible as I think it's perceived currently. Now, trust me, I'm not saying it's a good contract. It definitely is not. But I don't think it's one that it completely buries you and you're dead in the water if you acquire it, especially if you have the right context, like the Clippers, like the Jazz, for example, two of the examples in this video. I think that his contract, though, around the league is probably perceived a little bit more negative than I feel about it even, and I'm not, trust me, I'm not optimistic on it. I'm just a little bit more optimistic than most people around the league on that contract. I think 3 years or less is tradable for. I don't think it's the end of the world, but I do not expect him to actually get traded because of that contract. I think the soonest we'll see LaVine get dealt is probably this trade deadline. And honestly, to be real with you, the soonest it probably will happen, I think the earliest it could is the trade deadline, but the more likely outcome is that it either happens this upcoming offseason when there's only 2 years left on the contract, or the following trade deadline in 2026, giving, again, Chicago that flexibility for that offseason, and the fact that there would only be about 18 months left on his contract at that point in time. So I think teams would be more willing to talk themselves into that situation. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.